Salutations, and welcome to another installment of the full analysis of the Halo Beta series. For this installment, we'll be looking at a Halo Combat Evolved build that recently got leaked. This is Halo CE build 1749, a build dating back to approximately August 15th, 2001, exactly 3 months away from Halo 1's release date, November 15th, 2001. Taking these dates into account, it's surprising how early in development this build feels in terms of visuals and gameplay design choices, which I'll cover extensively throughout this video. Up until this installment of the Halo Beta analysis series, the builds I've covered only offered small fractions of the game's content, usually consisting of a handful of multiplayer levels. This is not the case for 1749. It contains the entire campaign as well as the multiplayer content, including all of the maps and game types that come with them. I've got a lot of work ahead of me to cover the major differences between this build and the final game, and just so we're clear, I'll be using the original Xbox version of the final build of Halo 1 as the main counterpart to this newly released beta, unless there's something I have to reference in the Gearbox PC port, which there are a couple of things here and there. Note that when I was recording the footage from the release version of the game, I was also using a debug executable for the purpose of enabling certain cheat commands to see various things in ways to help me make the comparisons between the two builds easier, such as teleporting to the camera position, spawning all of the weapons on a level, etc. This brings up debug text on screen at various points as well, so when you see them when I reference the final game, you'll know that it's still the final game. With all that said, let's begin the analysis. To begin our analysis, we'll look at the main menu. Overall, it's drastically different to what we'd get in the retail product. There are no Bink videos in this build at all, which are the pre-recorded videos that show the Bungie and Microsoft logos right before the main menu appears. There is also no music playing in the background whatsoever. The position of the Halo ring is much further away from the planet threshold than it is in the final game, where it's a lot closer to said planet. The camera position is also fixed in one location by default, but it will move to other specific locations if the player starts to navigate to other parts of the menu, such as the campaign or multiplayer section. This is much different in the final game, with the camera consistently shifting its focus to different parts of the ring regardless of the player's location in the menu. Moving on to the actual menu options in the 1749 build, there are two options relating to the campaign, titled New Campaign and Load Campaign. Going into New Campaign will automatically create a new profile and bring you to the profile naming screen. Once you name your profile, it'll say ready to begin new game. Pressing A will begin the campaign, while pressing B will simply bring you back to the main menu. All of this is much different in the final game. The campaign options are now simplified into one campaign option. It no longer creates a new profile upon entering the campaign menu, becoming an optional feature if you already have other profiles saved onto your console. The other two menu options, multiplayer and settings, are the same as they appear in the final game. However, the final game is an option that doesn't appear in 1749 by default: game demos. This is a section that will take the players to a bunch of different playable Xbox demos and non-playable video previews. There is an interesting bit of trivia regarding the game demo section though. The functionality is actually present in the 1749 build, but goes unused due to the lack of a game demos folder. If we take the game demos folder from the retail files and place them into the 1749 build, the menu string for game demos will actually appear, and it functions the same way as it does in retail. When opening up the Load Campaign menu option, you'll be taken to the Select Profile page, much like in retail. The key differences can be seen in the profile characteristics, however. The difficulty is referred to as skill level in this build, with the notable aspect being the impossible difficulty. This is the internal name for the legendary difficulty, and you'll be seeing quite a few internal names in general being used in this build. The control stat that is used in the final game is split up into two different stats in 1749, with one being the joystick set and the other being the button set. If the profile's current mission has too many characters in the title, the button set's configuration name will be cut off from the profile. All of the campaign missions are available in this build, with quite a few of the preview images being different from the ones used in retail. Two missions in particular have some stark differences when it comes to their descriptions. Assault on the Control Room has an entirely different name, being called Fortress World in 1749. The other major difference is the level description for Keyes, which reads, "Bring back the head of Captain Keyes." It's insinuating that Chief and Cortana are already aware that Keyes is dead before they return to the Truth and Reconciliation. It could also be possible that Chief was going to bring the literal head of Captain Keyes back to the Pillar of Autumn God of War 3 Helios style, but it could just be an extreme exaggeration for the command codes in Keyes' neural implants. One more thing to note regarding the available missions is the preview images for Keyes and the Maw. For Keyes, it appears that the coolant leaking from the Covenant cruiser was going to be a much brighter green earlier in development, but it could just be a placeholder effect. As for the Maw, it seems as if the mission was going to take place with much clearer skies, but again, it could just as likely be a placeholder skybox, as the final skybox is completely unique to the Maw. If you boot up the campaign menu with a newly created profile, the locked missions use a different preview image compared to final, using a white question mark on a black background. Perhaps one of the most striking differences in the main menu is the difficulty screen. There is no easy difficulty whatsoever. Only normal, heroic, and legendary resides in the build. I have a theory on why easy difficulty was made in the first place. Sure, normal is pretty much a cakewalk for a majority of Halo fans, and even non-Halo fans nowadays, but keep in mind the time period of Halo CE's development and release. Console shooters were nowhere near close to being mainstream as they are today, with GoldenEye, Perfect Dark, and Doom 64 being some of the few examples that made FPS games work at all with a gamepad at the time. Halo itself used a brand new control scheme that was exclusive to the original Xbox controller, and not seen practically anywhere else prior to Halo. Many of us today have decades worth of console FPS experience under our belts, while the testers from 2001 had 4 years at best during a time of radical experimentation. With this in mind, an easy difficulty makes sense. It allowed players to get used to this foreign control scheme without dying nearly as much as they would on normal difficulty or higher, keeping player retention. Then, as they got better at the game and yearned for a greater challenge, they could tackle the harder difficulties. There's still plenty more to talk about here in the difficulty screen though. The artwork used for each difficulty is radically different compared to retail. The shield design differs from its retail counterpart. Normal difficulties graphics are essentially the same as easy's, which would change to include a single machete in the final game. Heroic has the two blades like it does in retail, looking more like swords than machetes in 1749. Lastly, the legendary difficulty shows off an elite skull that looks almost nothing like its retail counterpart. On top of this, each of the difficulty descriptions are different in 1749 and are generally longer than the ones used in the final product. When launching the campaign, or on occasion multiplayer levels, the loading screen will appear. In 1749, it's nothing but a red progress bar behind a black background, which would become a much more stylized loading screen in the final game with its own visuals and music. Moving on to the multiplayer portion of the menu, we see an additional option that goes unused in retail, Quick Start. This is a split screen mode that simply picks a multiplayer map at random with regular Slayer as the standard game type. The standard split screen mode of play isn't much different from the final game, but there's one very notable change. In 1749, solo players are able to start a multiplayer match without the need of a second player. This was changed in retail, with the minimum player count set to 2 instead of 1. While we're in 1749's split-screen pregame lobby, there are a couple differences regarding the images used for the Xbox console and Duke controller. In 1749, the Duke controller is the prototype Dakota pad that was used during the development of the original Xbox. The controller itself is very similar to the retail Duke, but the key difference is the pure green jewel in the middle, whereas the retail Duke has the standard black Xbox logo instead. The Xbox console graphic in 1749 is also placed at an angle. In the final game, the controller uses the graphic for the retail Duke, while the console has been straightened out. The System Link menu is also not too different from Final, but there are a couple of changes. The string that says looking for games in Final is labeled as still looking for games in 1749. The player also has to press X to create a System Link lobby in 1749, whereas they have to use Y in the final game. In the System Link pregame lobby, when a free-for-all game mode is selected, players on opposing Xbox consoles will have their controllers be designated with blue lights as if they were on the blue team in a team-based game type. This is changed in retail, with the color being a much lighter blue color. Like the campaign maps, all of the multiplayer levels are in this pre-release build as well. and there's plenty of more differences to talk about here in the map list. Battle Creek, Derelict, and Chiron TL34 are using their internal map file names instead of their retail ones, with Battle Creek being Beaver Creek, Derelict being Carousel, and Chiron TL34 being Putt Putt. Both Derelict and Chiron TL34 have different map descriptions as well. Derelict's beta description reads, Higher, Higher, Renew, whereas the finals description reads, Deep Space Anomaly number 0198. Meanwhile, Chiron TL34's beta description reads, Spartan Training Facility TL34, with a reference to the final map name being used. The final description reads, Spartan Clone Training Complex. Once again, like the campaign maps, a good portion of the map images depict older versions of the multiplayer levels. Unfortunately, the majority of the maps with these type of map images don't actually reflect what's shown in the picture, and are mostly closer to their retail counterparts. These maps include Sidewinder, Damnation, Hang 'em High, Derelict, and Wizard. Longest doesn't even show any map visuals in its image, just the word Longest. Damnation is probably the most interesting case, however. It's one of the maps that has a map image that doesn't reflect the current state of the level, but the image itself, as well as the map description, depicts a significantly different take of the map. Damnation was originally going to be a mostly outdoor level that would have taken place on the ruins of Planet Reach. It's unknown if the buildings were civilian or military in origin, but visible destruction can be seen in one of the buildings, most likely caused by a previous battle. It's a shame we never got to see an in-game rendition of a map set on Reach in the Halo CE engine. It would have been very interesting to see what Reach could have looked like in Bungie's original vision from 2001. The final map picture depicts Damnation in its current form, a Covenant Hydro processing facility stationed on Installation 04. There were two significant differences that I found in the Edit Gametypes menu. None of the default game types are locked, meaning you could delete them if you wanted to. Deleting a game type brings up this interesting text box. It reads, This game type will be permanently and irrevocably obliterated. Are you sure you wish to delete it? The final description isn't nearly as edgy, only asking if you're sure you wish to delete the game type. The last main menu location we'll be looking at is the settings menu. The description for changing your profile name reads, Change the name of the current profile. You know you want to. The final description reads, Rename the profile using the virtual keyboard. Structurally, the control setup submenu is the same as final, but there are a few missing presets. Joystick configuration are missing the Southpaw and Legacy Southpaw presets in 1749. Meanwhile, button configuration is missing the Boxer and Green Thumb button presets. Advanced controls are mostly similar to what is shown in the final game, but it's missing the settings for inverted flight controls for the Banshee. Lastly, the Save Changes feature showcases a different graphic. In 1749, it shows a text box that asks if you want to permanently save all of your changes. Clicking yes will save your changes and give you this text box that's partly cut off at the bottom. The final text box is a lot cleaner, with no sections cropped whatsoever. On a foundational level, Halo Combat Evolved build 1749 isn't too drastically different to what we'd get in the finished product. The gameplay is still as tight as ever, and anyone who has played Halo CE in the past would have no trouble adapting to this pre-release environment. However, there are a metric ton of subtle characteristics exclusively present in this build that would have impacted Halo CE pretty significantly had they made it into the final game. The field of view is noticeably higher than what is shown in the retail product. The value is set to 70 in the final game, but appears to be somewhere in the high 80s or low 90s in 1749. The HUD is pretty much the same as it is in retail, but there are a couple of subtle differences. The shield recharge sound effect is at a much higher pitch in the beta.
Pelican Echo 419, anybody reading me? Repeat, any UNSC personnel respond.
The shield recharge speed is also consistently the same regardless of what difficulty you're playing on in the campaign. This was changed in retail, where the speed is increased when playing on Heroic or Legendary. The motion tracker pings vehicles with a green dot, regardless of which team they're on, so it could be a Pelican or a Ghost and it'll always display as green. The action of picking up a weapon is a lot more sensitive in 1749. All the player has to do is tap the X button and the weapon is picked up. In retail, the player has to hold down the X button for a short period of time to pick up a weapon. The button combos from CE such as double melee and backpack reloading, still work in this build. It's impossible to perform the silent weapon switch exploit properly, which is done by meleeing at the exact moment of switching to your secondary weapon. In 1749, the weapon ready sound will always play out regardless of the action being performed. The 180 glitch miraculously doesn't work in this build. For those who are unaware of what the 180 glitch is, it's an illusion-based glitch where your fired projectile will go nowhere near the target and veer to the side despite aiming straight forward. This is due to your biped aiming the weapon in a different direction in third person unbeknownst to you, and this commonly happens when you're hit by a grenade while jumping. Again, this doesn't happen at all in the beta, but something went wrong between this build and the finished product that caused this glitch to sneak its way into the game. Many of the weapons in this build aren't that much different to their final game counterparts, but some of them have major differences. The pistol type weapons in the final game have an iconic glitch where the Spartan's head will rise upward when the player is aiming all the way to the ground. This allowed machinimas like Red vs Blue to have scenes with characters talking to each other without having their weapons drawn. Miraculously, this glitch doesn't exist in 1749, with the Spartan actually staring at the ground when aiming all the way down. As for the actual weapons themselves, I'll start with the Needler. It doesn't have the build-up fire rate it has in the final game, starting out with its maximum fire rate of 10 needles per second. This was changed to have the weapon start with a 3 needle per second fire rate, then build up to 10 after a second of holding the trigger. The firing sound for the Needler is different as well, using a sound effect that's not as loud and nowhere near stylistic as its retail counterpart. The amount of spare ammunition the Needler can hold was drastically larger in 1749, with the cap all the way up to 240 needles. This was heavily reduced in the final game, with the cap sitting at 80 spare needles. The reload effect is unpolished in this build. When performing a partial reload, the remaining needles disappear and then reappear the moment the Needler reload flick is finished, but the spent needles don't appear until at the very end of the animation, magically shooting out of the gun. When performing a full reload, none of the needles reappear until the reload animation is over. Lastly, when under the effects of active camo, the needles are gone entirely, even when the camo immediately starts. The plasma rifle looks radically different compared to its final counterpart, and that's thanks to a row of 5 green symbols on the side of the weapon instead of the heat gauge. These symbols act as a visual battery meter for the plasma rifle, with each symbol slowly disintegrating as the battery drains lower over time. This will be changed to the iconic heat gauge seen in the final game, most likely because not only does the heat gauge provide a much more useful bit of information than simply showing the battery strength again, but it's also likely that the symbols were removed due to how subtle and potentially confusing this was to the player. Upon picking up active camo, the green symbols immediately disappear, whereas the heat gauge in the final game remains present while the player is invisible. The Plasma Pistol's charging animations are incomplete in this build, with the gun and Chief's arms freezing in place until the bolt is discharged. The charging effect for the Plasma Pistol emits a white light around it, which fades away after a couple of seconds. This was changed to be a green light which sticks around indefinitely until the Plasma Pistol is fired in the final game. The overcharge shot also has the ability to heavily stun enemy players in multiplayer. This trait devolves most encounters into an overcharge shot into either a free melee kill or a free grenade kill. Thankfully, this was removed in the final game. All grenades that are lying on the ground, even those that spawn there and didn't drop from a biped, can cause a chain reaction when another explosion's radius hits them. This was changed in retail so that only grenades dropped by a biped can cause chain reactions. The plasma grenade uses entirely different effects in 1749. The detonation timer effect is much brighter and has blue electrical sparks that surround it. The following explosion is a lot greener than it is in the final game, and uses a much deeper sound effect. This was the same sound effect that was used during the summer 2001 presentations for Halo CE. The assault rifle's third-person reload animation is a lot slower than its final counterpart, despite the fact that the first-person reload speed is the same as retail's. This was a remnant of the original reload speed for the assault rifle, which could be seen in some of the earlier gameplay demos for Halo CE. When picking up camo, the ammo counter disappears, while it stays illuminated in the final game. The pistol can hold a significantly higher amount of spare ammunition in 1749, twice the amount that it can in retail. In 1749, the pistol can hold up to 240 spare rounds, just like the Needler, while 120 rounds is the cap in the final game. The shotgun performance is pretty different to retail. It too has much higher spare ammunition, capping at 96 spare shells compared to the final game's cap of 60. The recovery time between firing the shotgun is significantly longer than in retail, with the user having to wait for an entire second to fire the weapon again after the pump action. The damage is slightly weaker in 1749 as well, but not enough to the point that it makes much of a difference. In 1749, the damage rolls from 16 to 24 damage per pellet, and in retail, it ranges from 18 to 25 damage per pellet. The shotgun also had a slightly longer melee animation in the beta, whereas it was a bit shortened in the final game. The sniper rifle lacks sound effects for turning the night vision on and off. The damage also rolls from 70 to 80 in the beta, to always rolling 101 damage per shot in the final game. The last weapon we'll be talking about is the flamethrower, and I have a lot to say about this weapon. Miraculously, the flamethrower actually appears in the campaign without the need to spawn one in through modding, and it appears on every mission during the second half of the game. Even Flood combat forms will be seen using it from time to time. The flamethrower has entirely unique HUD elements seen nowhere else in all of Halo 1's releases. The crosshair is nearly identical to the flamethrower used in Halo 3, compared to the Halo PC flamethrower which simply used the shotgun's crosshair. The bar beneath the spare ammunition counter shows how much fuel is left in the canister before you have to reload, with a small flame symbol included. The small canister symbol next to the spare ammo counter also never gets used anywhere outside of this build, at least to our knowledge as of this video. The one used in Halo PC is entirely different. The flamethrower in Halo PC also overheats, and its flame projectiles cause water to evaporate and summon clouds of steam. Neither of these things happen with the 1749 flamethrower. The small display screen on the flamethrower is different here compared to Halo PCs as well. The left portion shows a heat meter, which is pretty useless considering the flamethrower never generates enough heat for the weapon to overheat. The second one I'm not entirely sure, probably trigger pressure? The last one is another ammunition meter, once again showing how much fuel you have left in your canister. The flamethrower in 1749 fires one projectile at a time with a fire rate of 15 rounds per second, while the Halo PC flamethrower fires 2 projectiles at a time at a fire rate of 12 rounds per second. The flamethrower on Halo PC is fired from the weapon's origin, while it's fired from the central camera position in 1749. What this means is the Halo PC's flame projectiles are actually expelled from the weapon's barrel in third person, whereas the flame projectiles in 1749 are shown above the barrel. The weapon is a bit wonky to use in combat. The damage effects appear to be located at the very front edge of the projectile, and using it too close against an enemy will render the weapon ineffective due to the damage effect not touching them directly. If the flamethrower does properly make contact with an enemy and they end up getting killed by it, a very interesting event happens. Enemies will proceed to drop their weapons and start running around in circles for a few seconds. They'll drop dead shortly after. Surprisingly, this can also affect player characters. Here I'm shooting a co-op Spartan with the flamethrower, and when I kill it, the biped will drop its weapons and start to move around in circles all on its own without any inputs from the controller. Like the AI enemies, it'll fall over and die after the running cycle is over. The third-person animations for the flamethrower are also unique to 1749. Everything from the idle, melee, reload, and grenade throw animations are entirely different from the ones used on Halo PC, and I have a theory about why this is. Up until now, I haven't spoken about the retail Xbox's flamethrower. For those who are unaware, the flamethrower still appears in the map files for both the library and keys. Unfortunately, the HUD elements, damage effects, and the third-person animations were all removed from the game by the time Halo CE released on the Xbox. It appears Gearbox had to start over from scratch when making the aforementioned aspects for the flamethrower. Moving on from the weapons, I'll begin talking about the vehicles. The vehicle physics in this build are pretty out of whack compared to what they become in the final game. Running into walls and other hard surfaces can sometimes result in the vehicles to get momentarily stuck inside the map geometry. If you're lucky enough, you can wiggle yourself out of there. Vehicles that are stuck in this state are extremely dangerous to the player. Touching them will result in a death. As for the individual vehicles, I'll start with the Warthog. The driving sound effects are incomplete, with some of the audio for the engine being missing. The tires cause more depression in this build as well, causing more sparks to appear on tiled surfaces when driving around. The HUD elements for passenger health are a bit different as well. Anyone sitting in the shotgun seat will show their health meter with a white outline that surrounds each of the bars. Oddly enough, the gunner seat doesn't show this. The turret's crosshair is radically different to what we get in the final game as well. Lastly, when driving over ice, the effect used is the same as when the Hog drives over snow. This eventually changes to actually show ice shards scattering around the frozen bodies of water. The Ghost is indestructible in the campaign, where it can be destroyed in the final game. The Ghost projectiles are also more accurate in the beta, with a maximum projectile error angle, which is a fancy way of saying projectile spread, of 1 degree in 1749, and a max error of 3 degrees in the final game. Unlike the Ghost, the Banshee can be destroyed by small arms fire, but there's no health bar assigned to it, and this will be applied to all the other destructible vehicles in this build. The Banshee's plasma guns are slightly more accurate in the beta, with the maximum error angle being 1 degree in 1749 and 2 degrees in retail. The Banshee driving sound effects are extremely high pitched in 1749, sounding nothing like its final game counterpart. The Banshee's handling is noticeably tighter in 1749 than it is in the final game. You can practically stop dead in your tracks in no time at all to follow up with going in a different direction. I'm not entirely sure if the driving mechanics for the Banshee are related to this, but it's impossible to perform the Banshee skip on the assault in the control room due to the pilot dropping like a rock shortly after spawning. The Banshee arguably suffers the most from the wonky vehicle collision detection seen in this build. I've had an instance where my Banshee ran into another Banshee and we were both stuck to each other in midair. The Scorpion's driving speed is noticeably faster in 1749 than it is in retail. The crosshair is slightly different in this build, with an off-center ready string right underneath the crosshair. It's always present as long as there's a shell ready to be fired from the cannon. When the main cannon is fired, the ready string will disappear for a few seconds until the weapon is ready to be fired again. In the final game, the ready string was removed, and 4 dots showing the reload time was used instead. The Scorpion is completely destructible in 1749, but it's not a very easy thing to notice due to the vehicle lacking a destroyed variant. This was changed in retail to have the Scorpion be indestructible, just like the Warthog. The campaign variant of the Scorpion has the same see-through hatch that the multiplayer version of the Scorpion uses, whereas the final game's campaign Scorpion is solid and completely protects the driver. The coaxial machine gun uses the assault rifle's firing sound. The Scorpion's main cannon damage output rolls between 300 and 330 damage per shot, while in the final game, it sits at 351 damage with every shot. When passengers sit on the Scorpion's treads, no health bars are present. The first-person camera when sitting on the Scorpion treads in multiplayer is buried beneath the vehicle despite the fact that player's biped is correctly sitting on the tread. The Shade turret performs entirely different compared to its final counterpart. The rate of fire is lightning fast in 1749, so fast that the projectile's effects can't keep up with all the projectiles spawning into the map. In 1749, the rate of fire is double that of its final counterpart, with a maximum fire rate of 8 rounds per second and a maximum of 10. The final Shade turret has a maximum rate of fire of 4 per second and a maximum of 5. The Shade turret also has a heat gauge on the top left, but nothing shows up there when firing the weapon. There is a white light that illuminates from the Shade's base in 1749, and this effect goes completely unused in the final game. Typically, the Wraith is not drivable in the final game, and the only way to get into the driver's seat is to either enable it to be usable through mods, or to bump possess an elite which has the ability to drive the Wraith. The camera is very high above the vehicle and it's difficult to arc shots with it. Surprisingly, in 1749, the Wraith is actually drivable for the player. It uses the same rocket launcher crosshair that is used in retail, and the camera is located in a much more sensible spot for a player. It's still pretty difficult to arc the mortars however, but it's really neat to see this rendition of the Halo 1 Wraith anyway, which almost could have been usable in the final game. The Pelicans are a bit odd in this build. Their thrusters tilt downwards when landing, which makes no sense considering they have no need to do that thanks to the jet propulsion already pointing downwards. The canopy is a lot easier to see through as well, giving the player a much easier time to find out there are no pilots on the Pelican. The Echo 419 insignia that's supposed to show up on the Pelican is replaced with a 79 instead. I don't really know what this number is supposed to represent, so please let me know if you happen to know anything. Lastly, the Spirit dropship's turret uses the same beta projectile that the Shade uses, firing at a slightly higher rate of fire as well. Next, I'd like to cover the power-ups. A trait that concerns all power-ups is the fact they don't move when they're shot at by weapons or when hit by explosives. No matter what, they will always be stationary. The health pack uses an entirely different design in this build. In fact, on page 24 of the Halo manual that comes with the game, the health pack still uses this beta design. When walking over a health pack, there are no white lighting effects that drape the screen, and no sound effects play either. Similar things happen for the overshield and active camo, except the overshield plays the beta shield recharge sound effect. Another interesting quirk about the beta power-ups is that you can replenish them even if you're still under the effects of the original power-up. For example, if I have overshield and walk over another overshield, I'll actually pick it up and the shield will go back to full overshield. The last topic I'd like to cover for this video concerns the characters that appear in this game. The Master Chief's armor is a slightly lighter green color in the beta, darkening just a hair in the retail game. The two protrusions on top of the visor also casted shadows that were much less visible in the beta, but noticeably more so in final. When jumping without a weapon, or crouch jumping when holding a pistol type weapon, the third person animations used by the Chief are those used by the flamethrower. The animations are much more unique in the final game, with Chief spreading his arms further out. Captain Keyes uses the same design seen in both Halo PC and Halo CE Anniversary's classic graphics, which is essentially a beta design for him. In the final game, he actually has his own design which should have been used in all the other ports. The Marines are a rather interesting case in this build. Their permutations for their armor all seem to be randomly generated. You'll have some of the standard armored Marines, but you'll also have variants without shoulder, forearm, or thigh guards, which are types you don't see in the final game. The Sergeant's cap variant can be seen quite a bit more as well. The crewmen also look slightly different, with their suits looking quite a bit low res compared to their final game counterparts. Next up are the Covenant forces. All of the Covenant units in this game speak English. Yes, that includes the Hunters. Grunts and Jackals use standard Marine dialogue but at a higher pitch, while Elites and Hunters use Sergeant Johnson dialogue but at a much lower pitch. The dialogue reversal for the Sergeant Johnson lines had not happened yet in this build.
Show me what you got!
The enemies in this game also seem to take slightly more damage from weapons overall, making individual targets much easier to kill than they are in the final game, but the campaign makes up for this by spawning way more enemies on Heroic and Legendary, and I'll elaborate more on this in the next part. Grunts in general have much shinier back armor in this build, and they have the ability to charge up their plasma pistol shots. In retail, the only Covenant troops who use this feature are the Jackals. The Hunters are noticeably less durable in this game than in retail. All of the weapons in the game dish out more damage to their backsides than they do in the final game, with a notable example being the shotgun having a 2x multiplier against them, resulting in a one-shot kill even on Legendary. Other weapons like the assault rifle and even the plasma-based weaponry quickly dispatch them. The oddest thing, however, is their resilience to explosives. Hunters take either very little or no damage at all versus blast radius damage, and the multipliers for explosive damage such as rockets and grenades are significantly lower in this build. For example, Hunter armor has a 0.2x multiplier against rocket launchers and frag grenades. Explosion effects also don't play out if a projectile happens to land on a certain part of the Hunter's shield, making it appear to have absorbed the rockets. Lastly, if you melee the Hunter's shield, there's no proper sound effect tied to this material, so the game spits out debug text relating to this. The Elites are easily the most interesting Covey unit in this build. When shot at, the shield flares appear to be much lower res than they are in the final game. They also appear to berserk a lot sooner in combat than they do in retail, sometimes even on sight of the player, making them much more aggressive in 1749. Like the Marines, Elites also have a light armored variant, with this one depicting a sleeveless variant of the Elite combat harness, much like the one seen in Halo 4's Storm Covenant. Major Elites use the same type of armor that the Stealth, Spec Ops, and Zealots use, which is a lower poly model that has been used since the E3 2000 demo. They'd eventually wear the same type of armor that the Miners use in the final game, but with their traditional magenta red armor coloring. Stealth Elites are a lot more grey in this build, whereas in the final game they use a light blue armor color. The Zealots use an entirely different color scheme, using a brownish tan color instead of their traditional gold. The energy swords that they wield don't disintegrate when they're killed, but the player still cannot pick them up. The run cycle for the Elites when they use the sword is a bit different. When running straight, They tilt their heads to the side, whereas they're looking straight in retail. The energy sword is also noticeably weaker in 1749. It takes 2 to 3 hits to kill Marines regardless of difficulty, whereas in the final game, they die to one swing even on normal. Not much is different about the Sentinels in this game, but their engine sounds are noticeably louder in 1749, almost sounding like flying microwaves cooking food on high. Lastly, there's 343 Guilty Spark. Oh wait, oh no, I'm sorry, I mean...
Greetings. I am the monitor of Installation 04. I am 342 Guilty Spark.
342 Guilty Spark has low quality electrical sparks coming from the center of his body, and the light illuminating from his chassis can be extremely vibrant even from a distance. And that's going to be it for part 1 of this full analysis of the Halo 1 beta. Stay tuned for part 2 where I'll be going over all of the campaign and multiplayer maps included in this build. If, and only if, you enjoy this video, hit the like button, ring the bell to be notified on when I upload, and subscribe for more Halo content on this channel, and follow me on Twitch, Twitter, and join my Discord server as well. This is Dimensional Vadam, and I'll see you on the great journey.